let me start by saying what more or less is the conventional wisdom on capital flows. In general, there is the idea when we are talking about capital flows, booms and busts, the idea is that capital flows to the periphery are excessive and they end in crisis. And in general, well, there are many reasons why after a bonanza you can end in crisis. The most commonly argued reason is that monetary policy in the financial center, okay, could be at the trigger of these excessive booms and busts. Another issue that has come to the attention after the subprime crisis is that in general, when we are talking about panics in the financial center, these are preceded by large capital flow bonanzas, and they end up in a big crash, okay? In general, when we look at the cycles of monetary easing and tightening and capital flows, in general, we look at three experiences. We look at what happened in the mid-70s, beginning of the 1980s, the boom-bust cycles in the midst of the 1990s, and then most of it, the ones in the 2000s. And when we are talking about a role of the panics in the financial center, we mostly look at the crisis in 2007, 2008. Okay, when we have about three episodes of booms and busts and cycles in monetary policy, sometimes it's hard to identify monetary policy, especially because there are a lot of other events that coincide with easings and tightenings. So, for example, in the 1970s, we have the oil shocks. In the 2000s, we have the savings glut. We have the creation of the monetary union. So sometimes it's very hard to identify the role of monetary policy in the financial center. And in general, when we are looking at the role of a panic, a crisis in the financial center, we are just looking at 2008. Okay, so we have very few episodes, and one way of re-examining these issues is looking at a longer sample. So I have created a new database on international primary issuance that goes back to the 1820s after the end of the Napoleonic Wars. And this creation of the database has two advantages. First of all, we are going to compare, okay, after the 1970s episode with the episode of the gold standard, and during the gold standard, the financial center, okay, has not room for cyclical volatility. And second, when we are looking at panics, these are rare disasters. So if we look at a much longer episode, we have many more events. So it's going to be easier to test different hypotheses. Okay, so let me, just in case that I go over the board and I cannot end late, let me tell you what I find. So I'm going to be looking at two episodes of financial globalization, 1820 to 1931, and the 1970s until nowadays. I'm going to identify two different types of capital flow booms and busts. I'm going to define a systemic capital flow cycles as those that are around, okay, a panic in the financial center, like the ones around the crisis in 2008. And then I'm going to identify all other capital flows, booms and busts, as idiosyncratic capital flow cycles. Those are going to be unrelated, okay, to crisis in the financial center. So what do I find when I'm comparing, okay, capital flow bonanzas and busts back then and right now? So what I find is that systemic capital flow cycles, those around a panic in the financial center, are far less pronounced, okay, nowadays than what they were when the financial center was under the gold standard. Okay, and what I find is that it seems that it's the change in the monetary regime at the core of these changes. Okay, free from having to maintain the gold standard. Now we have cyclical monetary policy in the financial center. Not only cyclical, it's time varying. And when we are around a crisis in the financial center, what I find is that the movements in monetary policy are much more dramatic. So as you approach the crisis, okay, there is a tightening of monetary policy in the financial center, quite pronounced, and this cuts short, okay, capital flow bonanzas to the rest of the periphery. And once the crisis explodes, what we have is a very easy monetary policy, okay, that it softens, okay, the buzz, with the periphery being able to tap international capital markets. So the cycle, okay, we have lower bonanzas and we have more issuance during the bust. Okay, so let me say what tell you how I'm going to make the presentation. First, I'm going to talk the database. I'm going to be take some time to explain the database. It took me several years to construct the data, so you have to listen to all the pain that I've been through. So then I'm going to look at how I identify capital flow cycles. I'm going to look at the characteristics of the bonanzas and busts back then and right now. I'm going to be looking, okay, at what triggers these bonanzas and busts. I'm going to use to look at, we always do, the push and the pull factors. I'm going to present the results, and then I'm going to do some reflections. Okay, so how I construct this database, okay? I construct the database issue by issue, bond by bond, share by share that have been floated in international capital markets. And what I mean, back then the financial centers were London, Paris, Frankfurt and Berlin, and then New York, okay? So this has been collected from lots of many sources, okay? None of the sources is complete. There is a lot of overlap, okay, in the issues that you find in the different sources. And this was collected from annual reports of stock markets. So prospectuses, every time that you have to issue a bond or a share, you have to issue prospectus. So I get all that information from there. For the later period, I'm looking from the archives of the World Bank for the beginning, okay, for the 1970s, and then from the 1990s, you have the typical digital database like the Alogic, okay, or I use Bloomberg, a variety of different sources. What is important from here is that I'm not just concerned with sovereign issuance. Okay, this has both private and public issuance. Okay, so this is mostly the first database that is comprehensive, that you have both domestic and private and public debt. Okay, and you have the collection. It's important to collect the data from all the financial centers, because it's not just London, it's just Paris, Frankfurt, and Berlin that are important, and gravity works very well, especially for the private sector. So if you are looking at Turkey, you are looking at Russia, okay, it's basically Paris and Frankfurt and Berlin that are lending to those two countries. So it varies across, okay, regions and across financial centers. Okay, what is important when you are looking at two episodes of financial globalization is that you have exactly the same database. Both databases are granular. I have bond by bond, share by share. You have information not just on the amount issued, at what interest rate, but you also have the terms of repayment of these bonds. Okay. I had to construct also a database on fundamentals to examine, okay, the effect of push and pull factors. Okay, so this paper in particular has just Latin American countries in the periphery, but you know, we are the quintessential emerging markets, so it's representative of most emerging markets nowadays. So let me just give you a sense of how this data comes. This is a prospectus. This is no coincidence. This is a province of Buenos Aires, okay, although now I'm Mexican. So it's a 6% loan issued in 1870, okay, and it has information that is going to be redeemed in about 33 years. Bonds back then are like mortgages right now. They were of the sinking fund type. So you have a permanent an equal payment every year, okay? And then at the beginning you start paying interest rates, and at the end you are amortizing this loan. And it was issued at 88%. So this one was a rate well issue that it was issued in Paris, okay? And this was a rate well from Victoria to Minas Gerais in Brazil. Okay. So let me tell you a little bit about this data, show you what I have. This is issuance, gross issuance for Latin American countries. I have 7 Latin American countries, but were the major borrowers, the usual suspects: Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Peru, and Uruguay. Okay, and what you see here, okay, you see the booms and busts in millions of pounds. And what you have here, the blue is the public, the yellow is the private issuance. And in general, what you see every time that financial globalization starts, you are going to have mostly public sovereigns issuing, and then the private sector takes over. Just to have a sense, yes?
Two questions. Do you have the currency of the issuance?
Yes.
And if they're all Latin American and you said there's gravity, does that mean they're all clustered into New York?
I'm sorry?
Are they all clustering their fundraising in New York?
No. This is the episode of the gold standard. So everything mostly at the beginning is clustered in London. So everything is in British pounds, but we have the gold standard, and they were issuing in those currencies. They were not issuing in pesos or in escudos or whatever. Okay. So here you have a sense of how important these cycles were relative to the economy. So what I have is the ratio of issuance to share of exports. So you can see that the first episode of boom and bust was quite pronounced. These countries, after this boom and bust, they were in default, they were out of international capital markets. And here you can see, okay, the importance of bond issuance and share issuance in the first episode of financial globalization. Just to compare here, okay, you have again, okay, divided between public and private. Again, at the beginning, it was mostly sovereign borrowing. Okay, then at the end, when we are looking now at Latin America, they're issuing, okay, the private sector is issuing an important share of the total issuance. And here you have, okay, the cycles as a share, okay, of exports. Okay. So just to give you, I'm going to go fast on these figures. This is Argentina, okay. The blue bars are issuance year by year. Sometimes, okay, they are very volatile, so I always show, okay, 3-year moving averages to have a better sense of the cycles, okay? So this is Argentina. You all know this, okay? This is the issuance during the first boom in the 1970s. This is in the 1990s. Argentina was in default after 2001, and it didn't participate in the boom-bust of the later period. So here you have Brazil, okay, back then and right now. So, okay, we can, if you have any questions, we can talk afterwards about this difference. Colombia borrowed a lot, about almost 700% of exports. It was out of international capital markets, restructuring, okay, and continued to restructuring. And then in the early 20th century, started to issue again. Okay, so this is Mexico, this is Peru. Okay, and so here we have one of the biggest bonanzas in Peru's history, okay, with the collateral of guano. Peru borrow a lot, and this is Uruguay. Okay, so now I want to identify
Data on prices or
secondary markets.
or primary market?
In the primary market I have, not for all the issues. If I have the prospectus, I know at what price they were issued. We are now collecting with Pablo Vega. We are collecting data on secondary prices from 1820s, and we are going to do similar analysis, okay, as we do with issuance. Okay, so we have weekly data starting in 1820. Okay, so here I don't do anything new. I just try to identify each cycle with certain restrictions. Okay, so I use Harding and Pagan or Brian Boshan algorithm. And what I identify is not, I'm identifying medium to longer cycles. So I identify the peak, okay, under the assumption that the cycle cannot be shorter than 5 periods. And I also impose, okay, a certain minimum cycle at the peak, okay, with issuance about not less than 15% of exports. Okay, so once I use this algorithm, I identify 34 cycles for the first episode and 22 cycles for the second episode.
How many countries did you have again?
I have 7.
7.
Okay. So basically, it's Latin America because during the gold standard, these were the major countries, okay, the major participants in international capital markets. Okay, so you can obtain as usual, okay, what is the average duration of the cycles, what is the minimum boom, maximum boom, etc. Okay, so what I include in the bus is, remember that after the last cycle in the early 20th century, international capital markets disappeared with barriers imposed around the world. So the maximum bust is very large in the first period. Okay. So I have gross issuance, but in order to identify what is the amplitude of the boom or the bust, what I need to have is how much indebtedness you are creating. So I need to estimate net issuance. That means gross issuance minus amortization. Okay? And what I'm going to classify as the amplitude of the boom or the amplitude of the bust is the accumulated net issuance, okay, during the bonanza divided by exports at the peak. So this is going to be the amplitude of the bonanza. The amplitude of the bust is going to be, okay, how much issuance you have from the peak of the cycle to the trough, okay, divided by exports at the trough. Okay, so this is what I'm going to be looking at. Okay. There is a problem with estimating amortization. Okay, so in general, when you're looking at prospectus, you have the original, okay, plan of amortization, but those bonds were callable, okay, during the first episode of financial globalization. So, like mortgages now, when interest rates decline, everybody sells the issues a new bond and pays back the old bond. So what you need to do is estimate, okay? You need to find all the conversions that there are, okay? And also during both episodes, Latin American countries defaulted, so the debt was restructured. So you have to eliminate the old bonds, put the new bonds, and re-estimate, okay, the payment of the amortization. Exactly for the modern episode, you have the debt crisis. So you have to look at all the renegotiations, the reschedulings of all the syndicated loans, okay? And then they were converted into callable Brady bonds. And the same, you have to incorporate all the restructurings of the defaults of Argentina and Uruguay in the 2000s. Okay, so you need to do that to estimate new net issuance. Okay, so here you have, for example, a conversion bond, okay, of the Argentine 6% loans and the Buenos Aires 6% loans. They are converted into a new bond of 4.5%. So you see how the conversions were done. Okay, so this came out in a prospectus.
And it's issue only for sovereign or also for private sector?
These are for private sector too. Okay, so you have this prospectus. Nothing is complete. Okay, so you put together the database from prospectuses, from annual reports in the stock markets. I got information from the Credit Lyonnais, and I got information. I went into the archives, okay, of the Rothschilds, etc. So you have to put together all the database that is not complete. There is a lot of overlap. So you have, when you compile, okay, all the bonds, you have to be careful not to count the same bond 5 times. Okay, so it takes a lot of time. Okay. So let me present the data. Okay, here you have the amplitudes of the capital flow bonanzas, okay, and the amplitudes of the bust, okay, as a share of exports. Okay, each bar is identified with the name of the country and the year of the peak. So the blue bars, okay, are for the first episode of financial globalization, and the red bars, okay, capture the amplitude during the second episode of financial globalization.
This is cumulative borrowing normalized by exports?
Yes, net borrowing, okay?
Yes.
So now I would like to test of whether there is a change, okay, in the amplitudes of booms and busts, and here you have the difference in means, okay? So bonanzas were about, in the earlier period, were about 200% on average of exports, okay? And now they are about a little bit more than 100%, okay, of exports over the total period of the bonanza. Yes?
Just a clarification question. So if I understand your data about the bond equity issuances,
Yes.
as we know, there's also big flows that run through actually international loans, either banks to banks or banks to governments. There are also movements in derivatives, which over the last 20 years have been quite important. You're not controlling for any data, right?
I don't have derivatives, I have loans. Okay. Yeah, so especially in the second episode of financial globalization, syndicated loans were very important.
Right.
So
in the first episode, you have no information.
they were,
the priors that
no, and it was not as important as it was.
FDIs also, they are not in the old episode, but
No. In part, FDI is captured through issuance in the equity market. So, but there is not clear, I don't know when they are issuing equity, okay, whether it's catalog, can be catalog of FDI or not. It depends on how much of the firm you are buying, okay? Yes?
So would these results be different if you normalize by output as opposed to exports?
What I did for the second episode, I have the data on GDP. In the earlier period, I don't have the data on GDP, and even if they were, okay, I'm not very confident of how you estimate GDP going to the 1820s. Even constructing data on exports is very difficult in the earlier part of the period. You have to look at imports from the financial centers and start putting together all that data. And even that is difficult because many of these countries in the earlier part of the first episode of financial globalization, they were exporting gold and silver, and the financial centers do not identify that as commodities imported from that particular country. They identify that as a species. So you have to construct data of production of gold and silver. Yes?
But that might also be complicated by the fact that some of the countries, they gained independence during the Joseph period, right?
No, they gained independence before. okay, basically in the 1810s. With the exception of Uruguay, okay, that got independence from Brazil, okay, in 1828. But all the others were independent by the start of my sample, yes.
So, can you clarify again this issue of net issuance? So take the clearest example. So you have a bond, after a few years you refinance at 6%, and then you refinance it
At 4%.
at a lower interest rate,
Yeah.
3%. And so net issuance, so how does this show up in your data? So because you seem to have quantities.
These I have quantities, so if the bond...
So take this again, take
Yeah.
this start example. Does that, in what sense does this affect your measurement?
Because the sinking fund can be different, and therefore
What?
the sinking fund can be different and can change the amortization period.
Yes.
Okay, so it can be longer. Think about restructurings after a default. In general, okay,
Yeah.
you issue longer bonds. So you need to eliminate the old bond, and you need to introduce, okay, the amortization characteristics of the new bond that in general they are longer, they have longer horizons. Okay, so you eliminate one, you put the other one. Okay.
And it sort of shows up as a new issuance. Suppose this happens after 5 years of the first.
The first bond is eliminated,
Yeah.
and you add the new bond. The conversion is not going to appear, okay, in gross issuance because you are exchanging one bond for the other one, okay. But in net issuance, it's going to change depending on the characteristics of the bonds. Yes.
Yeah, and do you convert them on face value or on net present value of some sort?
Sorry.
So let's say I exchange $1 million that's due tomorrow for $2 million due 100 years from now.
Yeah.
Is that a plus $1 million, or is that, do you account for net present value difference?
No, I'm not doing present value difference. I'm just going year by year, okay, looking at net issuance.
But
Okay.
in principle you could, right? Because you have all the interest rates.
I'm sorry?
In principle you could, because you have the interest rates.
Yeah, I have interest rates. I'm not looking at interest rate payments. Okay, net capital flows, I'm not looking at that. Okay, I'm just looking at net issuance. Okay, so you see that the bonanzas have changed. They are smaller in size compared to what happened in the first episode of financial globalization. They are statistically different.
And then, sorry, go back to what Alf was saying. This may be a feature of the fact that exports over GDP went up. So that didn't depend. What's the question? What's the
Yeah. What I do
right?
in order to have the more volatility in the numerator is that I look at trend exports, so that is not as volatile, so that you have a boom
Right,
if there is a collapse in
Because
exports.
otherwise, we trend over globalization. You would see that right now.
Yeah.
Small, like a small
Yeah,
variation.
yeah.
Or even if that.
Yeah, so it always
That's
can
true.
be an effect of the denominator, but it's mostly the numerator. And here you have the bus. This is issuance during the bus, net issuance accumulated. And you see that now in the second episode of financial globalization, it seems that the bus are not so damaging as they were during the first episode of financial globalization. And in general, countries can issue more. Okay? So, so this is for all the borrowing cycles, okay? Then I want to differentiate between systemic and idiosyncratic, okay, cycles. So I identify, okay, when we have the crisis in the financial center, so I look at the literature. So the major financial center crisis, London 1825, the 1873 crisis in the continental Europe, Barings, and the crisis in the 1920s. Okay, and now we have the subprime crisis, and then in the 1980s we have the crisis of the U.S. commercial banking sector. Okay, in the midst of the defaults of all developing countries in the 1980s. Okay, so these are all the crises that I'm going to identify in the financial center. Okay, and so now I can classify all the capital flow cycles between systemic and idiosyncratic. So here, okay, you have, okay, how I classify them, okay. In general, everything is ad hoc, okay. But once I do this, I have 21 capital flow systemic cycles during the first episode of financial globalization, and 11 systemic capital flow cycles since the 1970s.
So sorry, what is the criterion again for calling it systemic? Within a 5-year window?
Yes. So now we have, okay, I'm just looking at all systemic versus all idiosyncratic capital flow cycles, bonanzas and busts. Okay, so the blues are systemic, the red are idiosyncratic. Again, you can reject the hypothesis that they are the same. Okay, bonanzas were much more pronounced during the first episode of financial globalization. When we are looking at busts, they don't look, okay, different. Okay, so what I'm going to do now, I'm going to separate systemic and idiosyncratic by episode and see what's going on. Okay, so here you have the first episode of financial globalization, and what you have is that the average systemic bonanza was about a little bit more than 200% of exports back then. Now it is about 150% of exports, and they are statistically different, okay, with capital flow bonanzas, the systemic ones being much larger in the first episode of financial globalization. What about the capital flow bonanzas now? Okay, basically they are the same. They are about 100% of exports during the second episode of financial globalization. So we cannot distinguish right now between systemic episodes and idiosyncratic episodes, at least for Latin American countries. What about the busts? Okay, so what you see is that the busts in the earlier period, net accumulated issuance during the bust was about 20%, about 40% for idiosyncratic ones. So busts, okay, during the first episode of financial globalization were much more dramatic. So there were no capital markets, you couldn't tap and borrow during bust episodes. What about now? So you have that on average, okay, the systemic, the accumulated net issuance during systemic episodes, okay, is much larger than during idiosyncratic. So it seems that there is a lot of liquidity. Yes, one second. Latin American countries, okay, can issue during their bust. Yes?
So if I understand right, going back to Albert's question, so these systemics are identified negatively. So it's systemic if it's close to a crisis, but not through booms that didn't result in crisis. So let's say there was a boom in the 1990s in the US financial industry that didn't result in a big crisis.
It's going to be identified, there was not a systemic crisis, so it's going to be identified as an idiosyncratic one.
Right, I was wondering if you can split them in systemic booms and systemic busts.
Yes.
Because here you see a big difference in the bust, whether it's systemic or idiosyncratic, but that's conditional on us identifying what's systemic by a bust. If we were more neutral, whether systemic could be both big movements up and down, maybe there will be difference in the first one.
It could be, but in general, when you're looking, these cycles are quite long, so it's not a 1 year on both sides episode. This is about, they are larger, they are longer. So in general, when you're looking at the second episode of financial globalization, the 1990s, okay, in the peak was about 96, okay? So you have quite before, okay, the cycles in the 2000s started. So yes, I could do some robustness, okay, but I'm pretty sure, okay, because the length of the cycles are not looking at sharp increases or sharp declines within a 1 year period. So I'm quite confident that I'm capturing, okay, both the classes that I'm talking about. So what you see here is that at least Latin American countries are tapping, okay, much more international capital markets in systemic episodes.
Also, this is different. Just one comment. Can you go back for a second? Because there's all this evidence that sudden stops in emerging markets tend to bunch together.
Mm-hmm.
Here you pick, for instance, the East Asian crisis.
The what?
97, for instance.
Uh-huh.
You see the bus. You see Brazil, Argentina.
Yes.
Perhaps idiosyncratic is a bit misleading. I understand what you mean, that it's not driven by events maybe in the financial center,
Mm-hmm.
but all of these countries were exposed somehow to a common.
The 70s.
No, 97, for instance, the East Asian crisis.
Yeah. Well, it's not here. Yeah.
Well, you see 97,
Yes.
but
Yeah.
you call it idiosyncratic. It's just a terminology.
Yeah. No. Here I'm looking at what happens. I understand what you're saying.
Yes.
So there was a crisis in Russia. There was a crisis in East
understand.
Asia. So, but the U.S.
Yes.
capital markets were working. So that's why I identify, and I understand what you're saying.
It's
but
just the terminology.
yeah. So I have 10 minutes, so we can talk after that, but I have to go on. Okay, so you can, here I'm looking at net issuance over the cycle, but you can also look net issuance, annual issuance, and you can compare the frequency distributions of annual issuance back then and right now. Just to give you a sense, okay? So this is the frequency distribution of issuance in the first episode. This is the second episode. They look different, okay? You can reject them, okay, using the Kolmogorov-Smirnov test. And what you see is that during the first episode, there is a lot of issuance, big issuance, okay? They tap international markets more than they are now, and they out of international capital markets, okay, a lot too, okay? So here it looks more like a distribution that is more less differentiated, okay? And exactly the same here. Okay, so the question is what has changed these capital flow cycles, bonanzas and busts. So I'm going to be looking at pull factors and push factors, okay? So, and I'm going to be looking, okay, at idiosyncratic and systemic cycles separately. Okay, so let me look at the event studies first, okay? So here you are looking at the 5-year episode around the peak, okay, of the cycles for every country. So the blue lines are the averages, and then the red dashed lines are the standard deviation bands. So here you can see these are the cycles, okay, relative to the mean of each period, okay? And you can see here that the cycles during systemic episodes are much more pronounced than what they are, okay, when international capital markets are well, and this financial center doesn't have a crisis. Here you have the pull factors. So you have exports growth rate relative to the mean of the sample, okay? And you have the terms of trade growth rate, again, relative to the mean of the sample. And what you see is that cycles, okay, during idiosyncratic, that the movements of exports and the terms of trade are not very different from the mean of the sample, but during systemic cycles, they are much more pronounced, okay? Booms in capital flows occur with booms in the terms of trade, and the collapse of capital flows with a big collapse, okay, in both exports and the terms of trade. So the question is, what is going on now? Okay, so again, here you can see that the cycles right now, the systemic ones and the idiosyncratic ones look very much the same, okay? But the volatility during systemic cycles in the fundamentals is as pronounced as it was back then, okay? So there is a big boom and a big bust, both in exports and the terms of trade. So it does not seem, okay, that the pull factors, okay, are having the same effect on the capital flow cycles, the systemic ones. Okay, what it's, so let me, okay, so now, sorry about this. Now what you have, yes, you have the push factors. What are the push factors in my sample? I have the evolution of the interest rate relative to the sample during the period. And I also look at 3 years changes in percent of the interest rate to see whether there are persistent movements, dramatic movements that are quite protracted, okay? And then I'm looking at the evolution of world imports growth rate as one of the push factors. What you see in the first episode of financial globalization is that there is not much difference between systemic and idiosyncratic cycles in monetary policy. The UK is under the gold standard, okay? It doesn't have the capability of following a very cyclical type of policy, okay? And so it's not very different what is happening with the interest rates in UK, okay, around crisis in the financial center relative to what is going on during the whole sample.
Which interest rate is this? Or how
This is the bank rate, the UK bank rate, the short-term interest rate. Okay? So, and you can see that around systemic cycles, there is a boom and bust in the world as a whole.
The interest rate is nominal or real?
I'm sorry?
Is it nominal or real?
This is nominal, okay? So you don't know what to use as expectations of inflation during the gold standard, so I use the nominal one. When you do that for the second episode of financial globalization, in general, if you look at the nominal and the real interest rate, there is a movement down. So I don't worry. I'm using also for comparisons the nominal interest rate. So let's look at what happens now. So these are the systemic cycles. These are the idiosyncratic ones. Now there is a big difference. Okay? When there is a systemic cycle, the interest rate in the United States moves a lot. Okay? It increases during the booms. Okay, and it declines dramatically during the bust, creating liquidity. Okay, this is the nominal interest rate relative to the interest rate during the sample, the whole sample. This is the 3-year percent increase in the interest rate. Okay, around the cycle, and you can see is that there are big differences in monetary policy when you have a problem in the financial center and when the financial center, okay, doesn't have a crisis. There is a it's not just that we have now cyclical monetary policy, we have time-varying cyclical monetary policy, and this is going to affect, okay, the rest of the world too.
I guess one problem in reading these pictures, which is also what you were hinting at, is that monetary policy itself is endogenous. So you would expect, in principle, this push factor to be low interest rates in the center. There's a lot of liquidity for the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Here you're finding the opposite. I mean, you're finding high interest rates
during the bonanza. Yeah.
But it's because, well,
they are tight.
Endogenous, and so the center is moving and you're raising interest rates for inflation or whatever.
Yeah. What I'm saying is that, yeah, it's endogenous, but endogenous to the U.S., not with respect to the emerging economy. So I wouldn't say that what's going on in Latin America is affecting.
No.
Yeah, no, I understand. Yeah.
Interesting to see how the growth rate of UK, US behave around these areas.
I'm sorry? Yeah, I have 1 minute, so let me, okay. But I started late, you know? So I have
So
5.
late, so I don't know how late you started.
Yeah, no, you arrived late. Okay. We were waiting for you, so I have 5 more minutes. Okay, so here I'm just doing some tests about the differences of monetary policy during crisis and during the whole sample. So here what you have is the 5-year increase in interest rate, okay, before the crisis in the financial center. And here you have the 5-year, the average 5-year around all the crises, okay, after there is a crisis in the financial center. So now I have to compare these changes, these average changes around a crisis in the financial center with all the sample. So what I do, I create a string, so 5-year strings, okay, of changes in interest rates, and I separate those positive strings and the negative strings, and this is what they are, okay? And what you see here during the first episode of financial globalization, the changes in interest rates are not very different in normal times and in crisis times for the financial center. And so you can see you cannot distinguish them using their p-values. What happens right now? So again, this is the average increase in interest rates in percent in the United States during this episode. Okay, and we have two crises, one around the 1980s, one around the 2000s. Okay, you have what happens before and what happens after. And these are the average, okay, tightenings and average in percent, and the average easings during the whole sample, going from 1970 to 2015. And they are quite different, okay? So there is a difference, okay, in cyclicality around crisis in the financial center. Okay, so what did I find? Well, in general, pull factors, they look very much the same. Okay, we can do some regression analysis afterwards, but what happens during the boom and the bust during episodes of crisis in the financial center, that they are quite pronounced both back then and right now. So there is not much, okay, to explain why the capital flow bonanzas have become smaller. Okay, what about the push factors? Again, okay, when we are looking at the real growth in economic activity, okay, back then and right now, there is not much difference, okay? When we have a systemic crisis, okay, booms and busts are much more pronounced in economic activity. The difference comes, okay, with monetary policy. When you have the restrictions imposed by the gold standard, okay, then you cannot do much monetary policy. When you abandon that, it becomes more cyclical and also quite time varying, much more dramatic around crisis in the financial center. Okay, well, here I'm testing this hypothesis. Okay, these are preliminary estimates, and what you see, I just have interactive dummies to see whether, okay, during systemic cycles in the second episode, there is, okay, changes, the effect of changes in monetary policy affect both bonanzas and busts, and you can see that those are the only ones that are affected, bonanzas and busts, okay, reducing the issuance during the bonanza and increasing the issuance during the bust. Okay, so to conclude, let me just have some reflections. I don't have a conclusion for some of these issues. Okay, so in general, we know that booms and bust cycles are hardly perennials, but they are changing. Okay, during the gold standard, with no lender of last resort, a financial panic in the center triggers a collapse of liquidity, waves of sovereign defaults, and a collapse in economic growth, both in the center and in the periphery. Okay. Once you have no more gold standard to adhere to, okay, monetary policy can change, okay, and can introduce more liquidity during the bust and reduce liquidity during the bonanza, okay. Still, when we are looking at the financial center, okay, after a systemic crisis, there is a large collapse in economic activity, even with, okay, easing in monetary policy. The experiences in the emerging periphery are diverse. We were looking at the 1980s, okay, all these countries defaulted, but there were continuous renegotiations. You remember the Baker Plan and then the Brady Plan. There was a lot of injection of liquidity. Many said that it was too much leverage, okay? After all this continuous renegotiation, we still have a collapse in crisis. And many thought about Latin America back then as the lost decade of Latin America. What about the post-2008? Okay, developing countries have not defaulted. They continue tapping international markets, increasing leveraging in the emerging markets were too. So the question, and I don't answer this question, and that's why I have a reflection, is increasing leverage too much of a good thing? So I think that I'm done. Yes, and there are questions, yes.
Can you compute some measure of a risk premium, maybe by using the stock market return over like the risk-free bond?
No.
Long and short?
Yeah, no, you don't know how much time. This I put together all this database, okay? Just making photos of this and putting or compiling everything. Yeah, no, I don't have. What I'm doing right now, that is the question that Fernando was asking, is I'm having secondary prices, yes, and now I'm collecting data of bonds in the secondary market back then, and of course I have right now. So, but we haven't examined that. But stock markets, no. Yeah.
Okay, so one thing, we're already like 6-7 minutes. Sorry. So we
Okay.
should move on.
Okay. Thank you very much for all your questions.